Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, everyone, and welcome to the first lecture in Baseerah Forum's new series, The First Pillar, The Proofs of God's Existence. My name is Radia. I am the president of Baseerah Forum and will be the MC for tonight. And we are just so excited to be able to bring the first of our lecture series to you today by the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I pray that it is beneficial for all of us. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which we are joining today. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm going to firstly very quickly run through a few housekeeping notes. So to ensure the best online experience for yourself and for everyone else, we ask that you please keep yourself on mute throughout the lecture. Inshallah, we will have a Q&A session at the end, so please submit your questions through the link I'm pasting into the chat right now. This lecture is also being recorded and will be made available to you all in the coming days, inshallah, but don't worry, your names and faces won't be shown in that. Also, we will be having a 10-minute break for Maghrib Salah about halfway through the meeting. So we ask that you all stay logged in and just tune back in after that 10-minute break, inshallah. So before I introduce our esteemed speaker for today's lecture, I'd like to give a very brief introduction to the series. The first pillar is a 3-week lecture series that aims to address the doubts regarding the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is a recognizable need to reconnect and to redevelop our faith and our conviction in the truth of Islam, particularly in a time where distractions are abundant and misinformation is so easily spread. It's only natural that many in the Muslim community, particularly the youth, are questioning the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in this lecture series, we aim to prove the existence of God by discussing the creation of the universe and the perfection and precision of natural phenomena. There is an innate human need to believe in a higher power, one that we will never fully understand but cannot dispute, and that is our focus. Inshallah, over the next 3 weeks, we hope to create a safe space where doubts are welcomed as we provide comprehensive evidence for the existence of one true God. In today's lecture, we will hear from a very special speaker to discuss the existence of God, proof through creation, as we aim to explain the arguments that prove only a being could create the universe. It is my pleasure to introduce Ustad Abdullah Andalusi, an international speaker and intellectual activist for Islam and Muslim affairs, who is joining us today all the way from the UK. Ustad Abdullah is an instructor at the Quran Institute and co-founder of the Muslim Debate Initiative. He has many years' experience explaining and demonstrating the intellectual proofs of the existence of Allah. So that makes him an expert on today's topic, inshallah. With that being said, I will hand over to Ustad Abdullah.
Jazakallah khairan. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. As-salatu was-salam Nabi Kareem Muhammad wa ala ali tayyibin wa sahbihi salihin. I'd like to thank the organizers at Baseerah Forum and the Sheikh for inviting me to talk about this much needed topic, which is establishing a kind of firm pillar for our beliefs and our creed, namely the belief in one God. So inshallah, I'll kind of go into some of this discussion. The Quran has a number of different discussions on God's existence. There are kind of 2 angles that the Quran approaches the discussion of God, full stop. One of them is the verses which we see in the Quran that talk about the heavens and the earth. We see that a big kind of angle that it's approaching these topics with is to discuss to a polytheist audience how the universe can only have one creator behind it, not multiple creators, or there can't be more than one deities that are controlling everything in the universe, or that cause it to exist. Otherwise, there would be much kind of fraction, and there'd be much kind of contradiction within the universe itself, as the laws of physics will be changing constantly, and there'll be a kind of a contradiction between two wills that are behind everything, which can't be the case. But also the Quran, which has many layered meanings and is always relevant in any day and age to any audience in this day and age, we see that one of the main challenges to theism is not polytheism or monotheism. It's not polytheism, but is rather a type of atheism. Some would say that atheism and polytheism share similar characteristics, in that the polytheists would attribute to the divinity finitude, or would attribute to finite things divine qualities. So in essence, these things haven't really moved on or changed since the past, because ultimately speaking, humans always attempt to attribute to the creator finite attributes, or they attribute to finite things something, the attributes of the creator, like eternality. So in this case, we're going to go into just discussing the current so-called alternative theories to God's existence and alternative explanations behind the universe. So one of the now many people get confused with regards to theoretical physics, because they believe that if a person is a physicist and they present is really a speculation on their part, and they dress it up with scientific, I say scientific language, but rather they dress it up with jargon from theoretical physics, and it sounds very complicated and almost mysterious. They think, well, this must be a viable argument made by this physicist, because they are physicists, they are renowned, and they are atheists, and they're making an argument of how universe comes into being without a creator. The issue is that it's a reason why it's called theoretical physics and not actual physics, is because this is in the realm of speculation. And kind of a lot of what I tried to do is I try to show that if you examine these theories, these scientific theories, you'll see that they are speculative. Whereas when we kind of look through and understand the possible causes behind the universe, what we do is we're not like postulating something that exists that we need to verify empirically, like there's a teapot orbiting the sun. You have to verify that empirically. You can make the claim, but if there's no you're making a claim about something inside the universe which we haven't seen, so that requires to be justified. But we're not discussing about whether God exists inside the universe or not. We're discussing what are the only possible explanations for the existence of the universe itself, i.e., what is the cause of the universe? And does the universe have a cause? Does it need a cause? These are the most fundamental questions, the much more fundamental questions that we look into. And in essence, we as human beings with rational minds ask these much more fundamental questions than someone who's merely exploring the universe to find out what's inside the universe. And of course, to find out what's inside a box, you have to open the box. But we're not talking about what's inside a box. We're talking about where's the box come from, and so it's a different question entirely. So an empiricist is very valid to be empirical, as in to deduce things or to search for things that are apparent to the empiricist by observation inside this box of a universe, so to speak. But we are talking about the box itself. It's a different subject matter entirely. And some atheist empiricists, they kind of misapply empiricism to that which is beyond the empirical, but it exists nevertheless. So the origin of this universe, we will never be able to observe it directly. We can never observe it directly. And also fundamentally, the existence and being inside this universe, what is the smallest thing, let's say, made out of, let's just say, an empiricist could never fathom, or would never be able to even verify or know, because in order to understand what things are made of, these things need to be made of something smaller. And if there is a smallest thing, then we would never be able to understand what that thing is even made out of, because it's not made out. We can't break it down to anything further. And so empiricism is very limited as a tool in what it can do. It can only look at things which are composites, and basically analyze how much of a smaller thing that a thing is made out of, let's say, and it can't. It's limited by time. Empiricism can't go to the origins of all things to make a direct observation of the origins of all things. So let's start with something basic, and then we'll go to a bit more kind of, you could say, more advanced theoretical physical models, which are speculated to be an explanation behind the universe. So let's look at the Big Bang. So people say, now, interestingly enough, many atheists were against the idea of the Big Bang, because many atheists were for the idea of a kind of, you could say, unchanging eternal universe. So the universe has always looked the way it has been, and it's always been around forever in the past. Now, this theory or this idea was something that didn't require, from their view, the existence of God to explain, because if the universe has always been the way it was, it's eternal, it doesn't need a creator. However, when it was noticed, when there was obviously redshift in kind of light spectrum of light waves reaching us, it was seen that things are moving away from ourselves, and they're moving away in every direction. It became undeniable to postulate that the universe is expanding. So either we are even if we are right at the very middle of the universe and everything's moving away from us, that would be a demonstration of expansion. But obviously, it's most unlikely we're right in the middle of the universe, but still everything is moving away from us in all directions. And so the universe is basically is expanding. Space and time itself is expanding. So if it's expanding, then it must have come from an origin point to space and time, and that's basically as far as we've got in terms of what we can demonstrate physically, what is an explanation for the physical data we can observe. Now, that's where then the physicists many physicists, because there are a large majority of physicists who are theists, and there are also a large proportion of them who are atheist. Science doesn't really back up one way or the other in terms of direct observation, but it's the explanations behind what we observe which cause the physicists to diverge into being theist or monotheist, theist or atheist. So while we can show that the universe has been expanding, you can't say, I suppose, empirically that you know what happened that caused it, what caused it to expand, or did it come from a singularity, like a small tiny point, or was it just a small ball and then expanded, so a ball of certain size and it then expanded. There's a number of things that inflation can't really explain empirically. And now the question is, now the speculation comes in by the physicists. They try to now fill in the gap of what could cause a inflating universe. So without using more complicated jargon, I'll keep it nice and simple. There are a few basic models which are posited. So one you could say is let's say a cyclical model. So one model states that maybe the universe has been expanding and contracting and expanding and contracting eternally in the past, and we're now just currently in a particular expansion, and then it will go into a type of contraction. Now that was a type of cyclical model, but the problem with that model is that it brings in infinity into the finite, and that in sense infinity in time. And that means that the past, there was an infinite amount of universes in the past, expanding and then contracting to get to this point. The problem with that is that infinity is not completable. You can't complete infinity. If you can complete it, it's finite, right? If you can complete counting infinity, it's actually then finite. What that means is that our past has to be uncompletable to get to this point in time. But that doesn't make any sense, because if the past is uncompleted, and we know that to arrive at a particular point in a, let's say, a dependent chain of let's say, causes, you'd have to complete infinity, and we'd never arrive at this point. It's like me saying that this lecture will end after I finish an infinitely long presentation. Will it ever end? Or if before this lecture was to begin, the host was to announce that I'll be speaking in an infinite amount of time, we would never start the presentation. I'll never get to start the presentation. And that's a problem which, again, physicists and the models, many of the atheists who speculate this kind of model really don't really want to kind of address. And instead they'll try to make arguments like, oh, well, maybe you can have infinities in mathematics. They try to make this argument. And so maybe there is an infinity in the finite in our past. And again, even though George Cantor talked about things like infinite sets, it was not really infinite set of numbers. The numbers cannot be infinite. Many people tell me, some atheists have told me, the number line is infinite. And I say, but there is no number line. And they say, well, but there's like an infinite amount of numbers. And I say, well, no, in the decimal system, there's only 10 numbers. 1 to 9 and then 0. What we do is mathematics uses a counting rule, which is that any number we can conceive of, we can think of, or we can represent with our computation machines, we can represent by using the decimal system. That's it. That's all it is. And George Cantor never really proved that infinity exists in mathematics, but rather he basically, in essence, you could say, imagine the number line as a set, and just called it a set in a way. And then it's like me saying that I have a bag, and the bag contains infinite bags, right? Or a bag contains infinite things. The bag is finite, but I'm going to tell you to think of the contents of the bag as being infinite, or having infinite number of certain things. And that's it. And then, if I get that bag and I get a second bag that also has infinite number of things, I have two bags of two infinities. But in practice, in physics, there is no infinity in physics. And of course, whenever in the universe there's no infinity, in mathematics there's no infinity. There's just it's like me saying I can prove infinity is in mathematics by drawing the kind of infinity symbol. It looks like a number 8 turned sideways. Yeah, that doesn't prove infinity exists in mathematics. And whenever an infinity is predicted by a physical model, i.e. a mathematical model to represent something that's observed in the physical world, whenever an infinity is predicted by the equation, this physicist will tell you that's when we know the equation is incorrect. So whenever the equation ever gets to, let's say, a 1 divided by 0, basically, then it's going to, which equals infinity and will cause an error in your calculators, they know that the equation breaks down. They call it the equation breaks down. It doesn't explain this particular reality. And of course, quantum mechanics was discovered because a previous equation broke down. It imagined energy to be infinitely divisible. But energy actually is discrete in quanta, right? It's actually in discrete packets. And that's how they discovered quantum mechanics. It was because the previous model, which assumed energy could be divided infinitely, produced errors that didn't match the experimentation and predicted infinity. And then they discovered that, well, this can't be right. And then they, to their surprise, discovered that energy is not infinitely divisible, but can be broken down into quantum packets, small packets of energy, the smallest packets of energy. So there is no infinity in physics, and anything that predicts infinity, i.e., any equation whereby if you put the numbers in an equation that is meant to model something we can observe, and it ends up with a 1 divided by 0 at some point, that means the equation is incorrect, or doesn't deal with every situation, in essence. And there's many physicists would basically explain to you if a singularity is predicted, i.e. an infinity, there's a problem with the equation itself, and they have to use renormalization. Renormalization is when they try to rejig the equation to come to a result closer to what they can observe empirically. See, mathematical models are based upon, you could say, very simplified assumed assumptions. So if I see a ball that's bouncing on the ground, and the ball it bounces, and every time it bounces to half the height of what it bounced before, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Mathematics would predict that the ball would continue bouncing forever, infinitely, for infinite amount of time, because it will never reach zero. But the mathematical equations assume that the ball has point mass, so the mass is centered in a small point of it. There's no energy loss in gravity, and there's no deformation of the ball, which also involves energy loss as the ball bounces. All the things that exist in the physical world. And so it's basically mathematical models are simplified models of the world which don't represent the world itself, but are useful for rough approximations. That they are useful, but sometimes these models break down when you go into the details because they don't match reality 100%, and especially when they produce predictions of singularities or infinities in these models. So that's the first part of my presentation, is to show that people shouldn't get confused with theoretical physics speculations dressed up as valid scientific theories. The speculations can still be irrational and still contain contradictions, but because many theoretical physics are willing to, let's say, live with those contradictions, or in a way hope that you don't mind those contradictions or you don't notice those contradictions, they get away with making certain claims. And I think I'll give you one final example, and then we'll break up for the Maghrib prayer in where you are at. Of course, here it's early in the morning. It's 9:30 in the morning, of course. So Alexander Vilenkin is a theoretical physicist, and he posited an idea that the universe could come from nothing by itself. And what he did is he said that quantum nucleation occurs, so something it has a non-zero probability, he said, which means that he says that basically there could be a quantum fluctuation, let's say, just appearing out of nothing, and that possibility is not zero. It's very small, but not zero. And then once we start with that premise, eventually you can explain that once a quantum fluctuation happens and reaches a certain threshold, we now then have, once it reaches a certain threshold, that threshold as a starting point, we have the physical models to at least make a possible claim that once a quantum fluctuation at a certain threshold will cause a universe to come into existence and expansion to occur. Now, while the mathematical models or the models which are produced, which show that when there is a kind of quantum nucleation that reaches a certain level for a certain threshold, in order to generate kind of negative gravity, the thing that causes an expansionist kind of force. While that model could be a possibility as to once there is a quantum nucleation, the cause of quantum nucleation itself, he just hoped that you wouldn't ask too many questions about why he said that was not zero and why it could have come into existence. The best way to explain this, to give you an analogy now, because I want to keep this as simple as possible, is it's like me saying, if I was to inspect every oven in the country I'm in, every oven, the majority of ovens are going to probably not have a cake in it. But there is a non-zero probability that there'll be an oven somewhere that has a piece of dough with yeast in it or whatever. Let's say let's say, bread or cake or whatever, and that produces a cake or a loaf of bread or something like that. So, and we can explain from we have a mathematical model to show that from a dough that has yeast, the dough with yeast will expand and produce a loaf of bread. And you say that that's all very great. That might be, the case. That is the case. Most likely is the case. But where did the dough come from with the yeast? You've just said we could find. There's a non-zero probability that it can be. We can find it in any particular oven we look at randomly for all the ovens that exist in the country. And then once it exists, we have a model to explain how it could expand. Well, that's all great about how you explain it expanded from initial condition, but what caused that initial condition? You didn't explain that. You're just hoping that people don't ask that question, right? And that's the kind of fallibility behind their speculation. It is a speculation which starts off with an irrational postulate. It's just making a claim and then hoping that you don't investigate it further, and then saying, right, well, once I've made this claim that this exists, we can now explain how it could have expanded. Well, that's great. How it could have expanded might have been your models might predict exactly how it expanded from that initial point or piece, but you didn't explain where that piece comes from. You're just saying that something in essence comes from nothing, and you're hoping that people don't notice you're saying that because you're dressing it up with hiding it behind, let's say, probability. But probability it doesn't really explain anything. Probability is basically our way of measuring things that we don't know, we can't decisively predict from its cause, or we can't guarantee that it would always come about. So we have something to measure that called probability. So if I flip a coin, I can't guarantee myself to generate a heads or tails, but I can say, well, if I flip it twice, then there's a higher probability of getting a heads than if I just flipped it once, for example. That means that all the possible outcomes, that the probability of heads and tails are equal. They're equal to each other, and the probability is you get a probability of let's say 1 in 2, let's say, but that's not a guarantee, right? You could flip it 4 times and not get heads, let's say, but that's a smaller probability. That's what probability measures. Probability doesn't tell you what causes something. It's just a measure of the effects. What is the likelihood of the effect being a particular effect? That's it. And so that's where some theoretical physicists who want to not involve God in the equation, they try to hide their lack of a cause by dressing it up in something to distract you with, by saying, oh no, it's probability, randomness, as if randomness is a God that can create. Randomness is again what we something we give to effects. Effects are random, as in we can't determine or we see no order in an effect, but that doesn't explain the cause. Still doesn't explain the cause of those things. Anyway, so before we go to the second part, and inshallah we'll break up for Maghrib, and then we'll discuss rationally what can we exclusively deduce behind or let's say infer behind the cause of the universe, inshallah.
Jazakallah khairan, Ustad, a very interesting point to leave us on. So yes, we will be having a short break now for Maghrib Salah. Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome back to the second half of our lecture. Without any further ado, I'm going to hand it straight back to Ustad Abdullah to continue.
Okay, Jazakallah. Okay, so now we've got, inshallah, the physics out of the way, we can start using our rational minds to see what we can infer from what we can observe. The whole point of the intellect is to basically make inferences beyond what we can see. Many animals react simply to what they see, although some possess instinctual, you could say a type of instinctual knowledge, in that they prepare for things that they don't see, like storing away food for the winter, for hibernation, or bees designing hexagonal kind of storage place for the honey at different parts of the hive, and they end up perfect, meeting together in the middle, and it's a perfectly fitting structure. So if we don't really use our intellects, and we just say we'll only believe what we see, and we'll only discuss what we can, we won't go beyond what we can see, then there's no point having an intellect, because the whole point of it is to make deductions and inferences from what we can see to what we can't see. So let's kind of start with two basic approaches, and as I will show, these approaches are in the Quran. They're all they're all from the Quran. The first point will be, let's look at what we can see. So let's look at time as one example. Now, time, what is time? How do you measure time? Time can only be measured by looking at something that has a motion of something that returns to its same position at a regular, uniform amount of time. So, for example, the orbit of the sun or a clock, for example, are examples of things which they return to a state which they were before, and they're in motion, but they'll constantly return back to the same state at regular intervals and equidistant intervals. So that's in a way the only way you can ever measure time at all whatsoever. And I want to make that point because we'll see later on how interesting it matches up to what the Quran says. So we have the Earth rotating around, sort of moving around the Sun, orbiting the Sun. We have the Sun orbiting the center of our galaxy, and of course we have the Earth rotating on its axis. So we have a lot of rotational things to look at to measure time. Now, if we look at, because things are changing and things have been changing for some time, the question is, have things been rotating and changing, so to speak, for an eternity past, or was there a beginning? Well, as I said before, if time in the past was infinite, then it would take an infinite amount of time to get to this point. But infinity doesn't complete itself. Infinity can't be completed, and therefore we would never reach this point in time. Therefore, there was a start point to time itself. Time really just being what we call change. Time being the regularities of what we see behind change. And so, if there wasn't infinite change in the past, then there has to be a first change, a first beginning change of some kind. But now the question is, well, before change, what was there? Well, there was non-change. And non-change, by definition, can't go into change by itself. There has to be something that initiated the change, has to be an initiating factor to something which doesn't change, to then initiate change to happen. So what could be that cause that initiates change, initiates time itself? Well, either it's basically, let's look at the possibilities. So either it was happened by, let's say, randomness. But randomness is not really an explanation. Randomness just says that the effect happens and it's unpredictable. But it doesn't tell us anything about the cause, nothing at all. So that's not really an explanation. It's rather in need of an explanation. So then what's left? Well, the only possibility left is, since change can't come spontaneously from a state of absolute non-change, and there can't be infinite change in the past, then the only thing you're left is that there is something that initiated change. But what is the attribute of something that can initiate change? Well, if it was an automated mechanism, it's like maybe a massive clock or a cosmic clock of some kind, and it was programmed to create universes, let's just say. The question would arise: what makes the clock make what makes this cosmic cause make universes, or this cosmic factory make universes? Well, if you were to say, well, it has an internal mechanism that is moving, and it makes it make universes. And I say, okay, but then what's this movement of this so-called eternal, let's say, factory or eternal clock? Has it always been moving in the past inside itself? Its mechanism has always been moving, or what have you. If you say yes, then we're right back to where we started, which is you'll have an eternity past of change. In this case, inside this factory or this universal, this cosmic factory or this cosmic clock, and you still haven't explained anything. So there has to be an absolute beginning to change that is not something that's automatic or mechanistic, but has to be initiated. Now, if it's not automatic or mechanistic, if it's not coming from nothing, so it must come because from nothing comes. This something is an existent something because it has to exist, and it initiates change. And if the only way it can initiate change, there's no mechanism that is making it initiate change, is that it has to choose it. It has to, in essence, initiate it by choice, by will, and in a way, a free will, the only free will, if you truly think about it, the only real free will. And this is something that has will and can initiate change from nothing. If something can initiate change from nothing, then it can add energy. It can create energy or create movement from nothing. And if it can create movement or change or energy from nothing, then it is inexhaustible. Its power, power means your ability to cause an effect, is then unlimited. Because if you can create from nothing a state of nothing or no change, or adding something to reality, this thing can add to reality. And therefore, if it can add to reality itself, it is unlimited and omnipotent in power, because to be able to add to reality itself means that you're inexhaustible, because you're not. If you had a store of energy and you just use a store of energy, the store could run out. Now you might say, well, how do you know that this creator doesn't have a store of energy and then just decides to take from that store and make things out of it? But let's say to move energy from a store to actually doing something when that energy wasn't doing anything before still requires energy itself in a way. So to even move something from a storage to being used requires energy, and you have to move that stored energy, so to speak, and to do that you need to add energy into where it was none before. So any way you look at it, this omnipotent being can create energy from nothing, can create movement from nothing or change from nothing. It can add to reality, and it does so by choice, because anything else produces a contradiction. To say it has an internal mechanism, then that mechanism needs to be explained, as in what is the an infinite change that's happening inside this internal mechanism from the past. How can it do anything if it requires an infinite past to be completed in order for it to create a universe? Like if I had a factory and the factory was making universes, and to make our universe, this factory had to have produced infinite universes in the past, or infinite products to get to us, it wouldn't be able to. We would never reach this point in the creation cycle of this factory. And again, because infinite past, an infinite past of change is basically an infinite past of dependent changes. Each one depends on the one before it. Really can't exist, and will produce a contradiction in that you're waiting to complete something uncompletable. So the time itself demonstrates the existence, the necessary requirement of there being a creator that changed from no change, and to be able to do so demonstrated that he is of infinite power and infinite potential. And of course, then the next question is, of course, is that, well, why this specific universe? Why not a different universe of some kind? Now, someone might say, well, And some atheists have tried to get around this by saying maybe there are infinite universes of every particular variety you can imagine, which I find quite obviously funny because some atheists using rhetoric, they use a particular rhetoric. They say we don't believe in God, like we don't believe in fairies, goblins, and unicorns. And I say, well, if you have infinite universes, you do believe in fairies, goblins, and unicorns. And I say, well, how so? And I say, well, because if there was infinite universes with every possible thing that could exist, would exist in one of these universes, then out there somewhere in this multiverse, there is goblins, unicorns, and fairies, and that would mean that they exist. Because you insist that there are infinite universes out there of every particular variety, you have to exist. You have to believe in fairies, goblins, and unicorns, whereas we wouldn't believe so because we don't have any evidence for that. And that I find that quite ironic. However, even to posit that there are infinite universes with every possible kind of universe of different, even with different laws of physics, still needs to explain why any one particular universe and not another. So it's like if, let's say, I had an infinite factory, and the factory produced infinite things, it produced cars, it produced mobile phones, it produced beach balls, and at any one moment, let's say one moment it produces a type of Android phone, let's say, and then another moment it produces a flat screen TV. The question is, why at that one moment it produced a flat screen TV and not a car, let's say, even though it makes cars as well and does so, but why not that particular thing being was a flat screen TV and not a car, let's say, a particular car. And let's say when it produces a car, it produces, let's say, a type of BMW. Why not a type of Audi? There still needs to be an explanation for why there is something is made in one particular way and not another particular way for its own instance, of existence. Why does this universe have certain constants, certain laws of physics, and not a different law of physics? And they say, oh, that's because there are other universes out there that have different laws of physics. Say, no, I'm not asking about them. I'm asking about this universe. Why this particular law of physics for this universe? The specificity of this particular universe needs to be explained. And if they say, well, it was done by randomness, again, that's not an explanation. You're not talking about causes, you're talking about effects. Anyone that mentions the word random, you're talking about the effects, you're not talking about causes. You need to explain why this particular universe, having the particular attributes it does have and not different attributes. Positing that there are other universes that have different attributes doesn't explain anything. You're just saying that there are other things that also need explanation. You're increasing the burden of explanation, not decreasing it, by positing that there are other universes. So this particular universe, how it is made, the specific things that occur in this universe, the specific laws of physics that govern and are behind the regularities we see in this universe, that needs to be explained too. Why those particular laws when other laws can be conceived of. And that is something, again, that even theoretical physicists, they argue that they don't have an explanation for why a particular set of physics itself, why the particular set of laws. There's also now a third argument I bring, which is everything in the universe is dependent or contingent, as some people like to say. They call it the contingency argument. But I kind of want to use something. I want to use more plain English, so I'll just say, let's say everything in this universe is dependent. Now, the argument that if you have everything in the universe is dependent, the sum total of dependent things is dependent, and you can't have existence only of dependent things and no independent thing to be the basis, the anchor for all things which are dependent. Now, a dependent thing is basically something whose existence depends on something else and not in of itself. And you can't have a universe or of everything which its existence depends on something external to itself. Let me give you an analogy to understand this. So let's say I use this example quite typically. So let's say there's a food vending machine that has a chocolate bar, and there are people that want that chocolate bar, but they have no money. There's one person that wants it, but has no money, but wants that chocolate bar. So they ask their friend, "Do you have some money to use on that chocolate? Can you lend me some money? Because I want to go and get that chocolate bar out of the machine." But his friend doesn't have any money, and he asks his friend, and his friend also doesn't have any money, and he asks that his friend, and so on, and so forth. Even if you had an infinite amount of people who are asked to be lent money to get that chocolate bar out of that machine, if they were all poor to the point they don't have any money at all whatsoever, then even if you ask an infinite amount of, let's say, these hypothetical poor people, you wouldn't have any money to get that chocolate bar out of the machine. There has to be someone who has money and initiates the lending process. So even it says, all right, I'll lend it to you, and you can lend it to him, and lend it to him and her, and him and her, whatever, and all the way down the chain to someone who actually wants to get the chocolate bar out of the machine. So a universe of which only has dependent things in it, and if there is nothing else that exists outside it or whatever, there's just this universe of dependent things, would not explain how this universe comes into why everything is the way it is, and where it comes from, and in essence why the origin of these dependent things, who their existence depends on something else. Now someone says, well, but how do you know everything in the universe is dependent, right? How do you know this, right? Maybe they all are independent. Well, let's understand that, shall we, by looking at the opposite. So what is a independent thing? An independent thing is something which their existence is not dependent on anything outside itself. It exists due to its own sustaining property. It sustains itself, and it can't have any connection to anything else outside itself. Because it's not dependent on anything outside itself. Something that is independent can't be then affected by anything outside itself, because its own existence, which by kind of consequence, the mode of its existence is only dependent on itself, right? So it determines how it exists and what it does. If that's the case, then it can't be interacted with by anything outside itself. It is independent truly from anything outside itself. But what we witness is that everything in this universe is dependent because it interacts with each other and it affects each other. But also, if there was something that was independent, it wouldn't be in a universe of dependent things. It would be detached in a way from a universe of dependent things. So the only things that can exist in this universe, so to speak, that we would say are inside are things which are dependent anyway. And if they are dependent and they affect each other, then there has to be something independent that is not interactable, and is detached from us, but upon which all things depend. And that, of course, is something independent. And if it's independent, the question is, if it's independent, why did it even make dependent things in the first place? And again, if it is independent, it doesn't need to make things which are not dependent, but those dependent things can't be made by themselves or can't exist by themselves. Therefore, they need an explanation. And so the thing that basically is independent makes dependent things voluntarily and not out of necessity. Otherwise, these dependent things wouldn't be dependent. They'd be part of the independent thing itself. And so we end with the conclusion that the universe itself has to be dependent by the very fact that what exists in this universe that interacts with each other has to be dependent, and what is independent cannot be part of a universe of dependent things, but must exist to explain why there is a universe of dependent things. I have another argument, which I call an argument from space and time, that I can show how in both space and time, or both but space demonstrates things that have space or have extension are also dependent, and also there's an argument for time that I also have discussed, which also includes an argument that looks at what they might say as a block time, and shows how that block time must also require a creator to cause it to its existence. But that's a bit more advanced stuff, which I won't really go into here. However, I will finish off by simply saying that in the Quran, in Surah Al-Imran, verse 190, it says, in the creations of the heavens and the earth, and the difference of night and day, or the alternation of night and day, these are signs for men of al-albab, understanding. We also see that surely in the alternations of night and day, and in what Allah has created in the heavens and the earth, are signs for people who are God fearing, for those people who are open, who feel it in their fitrah to believe in something that is powerful, and they are open to belief in it, and they fear the consequence of disbelieving reality of things which could be real, and then they open their minds to the prospect. When they then observe and look at the universe, they will see with certitude that in the alternations of night and day and the creation of the heavens and the earth. And again, in another verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 164, it says these are signs for those who use their intellect. Yeah. So why does the Quran say in the alternation of night and day? The alternation of night and day is the measurement of time. And so time itself is a demonstration and proof of God's existence. And in the creation of the heavens and the earth, the origination of those things as well demonstrates the existence of God. And so in a way, the verse in the Quran is pointing us to look at both time and space, or things in space, and that both time and space demonstrate the existence of God, i.e. space-time demonstrates the existence of God. And this is a very wonderful verses, amazing verses in the Quran. They're all amazing, but this is very amazing in relevance to knowing God's existence. From that, the alternation of night and day is how we measure time. That's how because it's a cyclical system that returns back to its original set of conditions, so to speak, relative to ourselves. And that's what we use to measure time. Time itself and the creation of the heavens and the earth, these dependent things, are demonstrations of God's existence for those who use their intellect, for those who want to know the truth and fear rejecting the truth, those who have taqwa, and those who use their reason and understanding in al-albab. So that's basically 3 amazing verses in the Quran that in essence point to how these time and space itself are proofs of God's existence. So barakallahu feekum for listening, and inshallah let's open up to questions and answers.
Jazakallahu khairan, Ustad. That was incredibly insightful. May Allah reward you. So it does look like we'll be going over time, and I do apologize. But just a reminder that this is being recorded and will be made publicly accessible on our YouTube page, inshallah. So we do have quite a few questions that have come through, alhamdulillah. The first asks, with these theories, don't we assume that our rational systems hold true for what existed before the universe? And doesn't that make all theories inherently flawed?
Okay, so there's a misperception that our thinking abilities are based on or only would be valid for what happens inside this universe. And our thinking are based on models of how the universe works, and therefore we're trying to apply these outside the universe. Actually, it is the atheists that are guilty of this, to use speculations about how the universe works and then trying to extrapolate or try to project that onto what happens outside the universe. So they say that basically what happens outside the universe is the same as what happens inside the universe, and so therefore the laws of physics always exist, and there's always a constant laws of physics that has always been around and producing universes and things like that, like bubble nucleation or what have you, in false vacuums, which is basically Alexander Vilenkin's argument. This is incorrect. It's not based on us using man-made, human-made kind of logics. It's us avoiding the contradiction that would be inherent in arguing anything else is the explanation behind the universe. Now you might say, but the law of contradiction is a man-made law or the law of the universe. No, it's not. It's called the law of non-contradiction because it just tells human beings to not contradict themselves, but it's not actually a law. It's just, and I mean this in the most fundamental way, it is reality itself, and I'll explain that. The law of contradiction is simply telling us if something exists, it can't, or it does not exist, right? And if something doesn't exist, it can't exist at the same time. So what is reality and is not to be contradicted by non-reality, I suppose. And that's really all it is. So if something is, then it must be, it can't be is not at the same time. Right? That's all it is. We call it the law of non-contradiction just to tell, because humans need to call things laws. Just as we say the laws of physics are basically, we call it the laws of physics, but really it's just the regularities of the universe. The regularities that we see in the universe in similar situations, we derive a model from that, a mathematical set of relations, and we call that a law. It's not a law in the sense of man-made law, a law that we made and we impose it on the universe. It's just a way of us understanding and making a model of the regularities. And the law of non-contradiction is the most fundamental law there is for that we have, let's say, reminded ourselves of, in that it just simply states that if something exists, it does not exist, right? And if something does not exist, then it does not exist, right? So that's all it states. And if you were to say that the universe has an eternal past, you're saying a contradiction, that we have completed a non-completable series of a chain of dependent things. That's a contradiction. And it's purely to avoid contradictions that we come to the only possible explanation that avoids contradiction, and that is that the existence of God, who has a will and is omnipotent.
That's incredibly interesting. Jazakallah khair. So the second question is, there is much technical jargon when discussing this topic. Are there any suggestions on how to start developing solid understanding in these matters as a beginner?
It doesn't require you to study physics. It doesn't require you to adopt advanced philosophical jargon. You can do it quite simply. I've consciously tried to avoid complicated jargon or physics terms. I've mentioned a few though, but I've tried to avoid it and keep it as simple as possible, because it is actually quite simple. The only thing that's made things complicated is the desire by those who hate the conclusion or don't like the conclusion of a God. They use mental gymnastics and obfuscations, words designed to cover up kufr, words designed to cover up the truth or misdirect you from it or avoid. So they don't want to say a universe comes from nothing. They'll say there's a non-zero probability that in a false vacuum, bubble nucleation occurs. Wait, rewind that a bit. So what are you saying exactly? You see, it's because they cover up the basic contradiction inherent in their speculations, and by using jargon that we don't, most of us, let's say, are not familiar with, or we think it's or even those who are physicists sometimes maybe forget, or that this jargon is designed to cover up the inherent contradiction. And it's much like as a Christian or an advanced Christian theologian would explain the Trinity to you. They would use jargon. They would say that the God has one being but three persons, and a person is not the same as being. And they've used jargon to cover up the basic inherent contradiction that they're saying three and one at the same time. Because God is defined as one will, and which is omnipotent. if you had three wills which are all omnipotent, they can do anything they want, they would limit each other and they wouldn't be omnipotent. And that's the contradiction. But the Trinitarian wants to hide that by giving you jargon and giving you words to confuse you. You don't need to know physics to discuss this topic. You don't need to know philosophy or philosophical jargon to discuss this topic. But because the people who try to deny the obvious conclusion hide their own contradictions using jargon, we have to, in a way, familiarize ourselves enough to in a way, untangle it and say, no, you're contradicting yourself, and this is why you're contradicting yourself. And that's the only reason why anyone would ever delve into looking at this looking at jargon, looking at physics and so on in the first place, unless you want to be a physicist yourself or a philosopher. So you don't need to know philosophy, you don't need to know physics at all. But the only reason I reference those things, and I will discuss it, is because people are confused by the claims made by these physicists, and there are theist physicists who argue against them. Yeah, so just know that. So, but if you want to familiarize yourself with physics, which I would suggest you do for its own sake, right? You're learning about the universe created by the creator. So I would almost say that physics is part of theology. Theology is the study of the will of the creator, what he does, and so on. And physics is a study of his will. So learn it for that reason, mostly. And yeah, pick up a primer book and start equating yourself. There's a lot of popular science books, but start equating yourself with it. It's a very interesting subject to go into. It's quite fun as well.
I think you explained that really well. Thank you. And I think the final question that we will answer for today is, what is the best response to atheists or scientists who mock the idea of God?
Well, mocking is not an argument. They use rhetoric. And again, we could retaliate in a similar manner, but not in a crude or childish manner, by mocking their belief that they believe that something comes from nothing, or they believe in multiverses where there's fairies, goblins, and unicorns. They have to believe in fairies, goblins, and unicorns that exist because these things are possible creatures to some form. A small type of humanoid that has wings, a horse that has a horn growing from its head, a small green thing with pointy ears. That you can imagine universes where these exist, and planets maybe where that could exist in different universes, and therefore the atheist has to believe in fairies, goblins, and unicorns, with the stuff that they mock us for by comparing God to that. Even though God isn't a creature, isn't a limited thing inside a universe, but is the explanation for the reality that we are observing itself, fundamental explanation for reality itself. So yeah, of course. But also, if you want, I'll give you something more pertinent. You can also mock, not mock, but you could just point out the limitations of physics itself. Physics is about the relationship between things, and it explains things that we see by reference to the composites of it, like what it's made out of, its substance. The question is you can just bring up Zeno's paradoxes on this. And ironically, the philosopher Zeno argued that reality didn't make sense because he said that reality is infinitely divisible, and therefore you can't trust your senses, because if things are made of something, then what are those things made out of? And then if that's made of something else, what's that made out of? And what's that made out of? And what's that made out of? Ad infinitum. And they came to the conclusion that there has to be an infinite thing behind all things. But their mistake, Zeno's mistake, and the school of thought that he was coming from, their mistake was that they believed that your senses are lying to you, and the universe is itself just one unchanging, indivisible thing, right? Which is like, no, it clearly is changing, and there are things, like where is my observation coming from? Even if my senses are lying to me, I'm observing something and it's changing. So there is that's impossible to exist inside an infinite unchanging thing. But the infinite unchanging thing does exist. It's just not this universe, but it's underpinning everything in this universe, i.e., it is causing the most basic substance to exist, even though the most basic substance isn't made out of anything. But what gives it its attributes? Why does it do what it does if it's not made out of anything? Well, it's because it's being caused, and it's being sustained, right? And physics only measures the mathematical relationship between these basic forms of things, but it can't tell you what the smallest thing is made out of. It cannot. It's the limit of physics. Physics just tells you, like, let's say if a physicist, let's say, was to look at a game of football, or soccer, as the Americans call it, they would only measure the speed and the position of the players, the ball, and where it is at any particular moment. That's all it could measure. Let's say, for the sake of argument, it wouldn't tell you what the ball or the people are made out of if physics was about looking at football, let's just say, right? Because the fundamental unit would be the ball and the players. And I know that you could say, well, we do know what people are made out of and what balls are made out of. I know, but this is an analogy. At the smallest units of matter, which maybe are quarks, maybe are bosons and so on and so forth, but but why do they have the properties that they have? Why do they do with it? Now, maybe they're made out of something else. Maybe they're types of wavelengths and things. They're waves. But again, what are waves made out of? What are these basic waves made out of? What is the so-called vacuum made out of? What is space and time made out of? I could do that ad infinitum. And if there is no answer, then if you can divide reality up into infinitely, it's made out of nothing. And then why is there something when it's made out of infinitely divisible nothing, right? There has to be a basic layer to reality that is indivisible, but there has to be an explanation as to why it does what it does, and it can't be explained by what's inside it because it's not made of anything else. So it can only be explained by what's outside it, i.e. something is sustaining the most basic units of reality and giving it its attributes and moving it around, right? That's not an argument for God. That's almost going into my argument from space-time now. But that's the limits of physics. Physics can't go beyond the smallest units of reality, or even know it's even reached the smallest units of reality. It just measures what it does, like how it moves and where it moves. That's it. So you can mock physics and saying that your realm of study, interesting though it is fundamentally limited and cannot explain ultimately reality. I even have a video on my YouTube account about this one point. So anyway, you can mock them back and mock the limitedness of their field. They study what beings do, but they don't study what being is ultimately, to put it in a nutshell.
Jazakallah khair. That was very thought-provoking, and also it's not just the Americans; it's soccer to us as well in Australia. But anyway, that's unfortunately all the time that we have for today. I apologize if we didn't get to your question, but just remember that you can ask any follow-up questions through the Baseerah website, which is now in the chat box there. I just want to say Jazakallah khairan, Ustad Abdullah, for your time today and for your incredibly engaging and beneficial talk. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on behalf of all of us at Baseerah Forum to protect and preserve you and to continue to increase you in wisdom and influence. Ameen.